one of the hardest things to do as a founder is recognize that regardless of how it happens, you will leave one day. And if you want the cause to continue, if you want your mission to continue, you need to be thinking about how it outlives you.
I'm Rich Frazier.
And I'm Russ Phaneuf.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement.
We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector.
Let's dive in. Hey, Russ.
Hey, Rich.
I know that you love a good superhero origin story.
Love it.
Just like the next guy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's relevant because today we're talking about the founders of nonprofits.
Oh, they're like the superheroes of nonprofit, aren't they?
Exactly, because we wouldn't have nonprofits if it weren't for the founders. So we're going to talk about the origin stories for nonprofits. And we're going to talk about the founders and their role in the nonprofits. And we're going to follow their arc and starting that nonprofit, pulling the board of directors together, and following that life cycle of the nonprofit and that founder. And we have two expert guests today that we're going to talk to. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Stephanie Small.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm Stephanie Small. I'm the president and chief synergist of Synergy Partners Consulting. Been in the nonprofit sector for over 30 years now. Moved here to Phoenix, Arizona, about 30 years ago and started working for Valley of the Sun United Way before I had the opportunity to be a founding director of Free Arts for Abused Children of Arizona. Spent 14 years with Free Arts building that organization from a startup to a high growth organization, and then started my own consulting firm after working for a few years in capital campaigns. So I love working with the nonprofit sector, and I love working with nonprofit founders, and the passion and the energy that they bring to our community is just incredible. And I really, feel their struggles as their organizations get to a certain point in the life cycle where they start to struggle with, am I the right person to continue this on? So I'm really excited to have this conversation. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Patrick McWhorter.
Well, thank you for taking on this topic, and I'm thrilled to be talking about it as well. I've been in Arizona for about 40 years, mostly in the nonprofit sector, and I have a couple of lenses on this topic. One is I've been a founder a couple of times of nonprofits. One that I'm most known for is founding the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, the statewide association for the sector in Arizona that I led for 10 years and left about 7 years ago. And then I also have been involved on boards of nonprofits that were founded. And then when I was at the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, I consulted and talked to many organizations that were in various states of existence around their founding and their development, their life cycle. And so I'm really glad you're taking on this topic. I think it's an important one.
We're glad that you are here with us to talk to us about it. So let's just start at the beginning. What is a founder's role in a nonprofit?
Most often, a founder is somebody who either one has an expertise that is relevant to the mission of the nonprofit, and they come from that background. Stephanie mentioned the arts a moment ago. It might be an artist who has an expertise in that, kind of art and forms the organization. Or they are somebody who has a passion about an issue because they've been affected by it. I'm thinking of somebody that relatively recently founded an organization because she lost a child to cancer, and then she formed an organization that deals with children who are and their parents dealing with cancer. So it's somebody who has a great passion about the cause and figures out a way of starting an organization to address that passion.
I would also add to that founders, it's the issues that they're addressing are deeply personal to them. They're not looking at it saying, oh, I know I could build a great business plan here and that's where I'm going to go. Like a for-profit founder, might see a financial opportunity. Nonprofit founders come with deeply personal experiences for starting their nonprofits. And there's a lot of research on founders done by Dr. Susan Kenny-Stevens, where she kind of outlines different types of founders and what inspires them to do this type of work. But I can talk a little bit about Free Arts of Arizona. I'm considered the founding executive because I'm the first paid executive, but our founder is an art therapist, and she started Free Arts of Arizona because in her family background, she had a fairly dysfunctional childhood, and the arts are something that she said saved her life. So when she started Free Arts of Arizona, the chapter here, it was really with that deeply personal intent of, I want to save children's lives and offer them the experiences in the arts the same way the arts saved my life as a child growing up. Patrick mentioned a founder, of an organization whose child had cancer. So helping other parents, not experience the same type of pain or angst that you're going through. So really trying to help right that wrong. So that it's a more intrinsic value that they're getting out of starting a nonprofit organization, and really wanting to see, a lot of times it's kind of psychologically working through my own experience. If I had had this experience years ago, how would I be different as a person? And how would I bring these types of services to someone else so that they don't experience that type of hardship?
The other thing about comparing a founder of a nonprofit and a for-profit is that when it's a for-profit, you have some level of ownership, that can change over the years and so forth as the organization grows. In a nonprofit, you do not. You are not the owner of the organization, and that shapes the experience as well of the founder. So I think it kind of builds on the point Stephanie made about the fact that you're not in it for financial gain, or at least you shouldn't be. And that also has implications for that arc of the founder's story.
Starting a nonprofit organization is starting a small business. And it's arguably harder than starting a small business. And so the risk of failure is great, and the risk of disappointment is great, even more so because it's so deeply personal. When is a good time to start a nonprofit? And when is a bad time to start a nonprofit?
So I used to teach a class called To Be or Not to Be. And it was all for founders coming to the table to really understand, do I want to be a nonprofit? Should I be an LLC for-profit? Or do I even want to do this? And I have to say, the majority of founders that came to that class had no idea that they were starting a small business. They're not even focused on business. They're focused on the mission. And so I think that's another difference when you think about the for-profit founder. For-profit founders often come with some type of business experience or at least understanding of how a business works. Nonprofit founders are typically coming from the programmatic side, an art therapist, an artist, a parent with a child with a disability. They have perhaps expertise in that program field. They have usually no expertise in either nonprofit management or even, small business management. So a lot of times the founders in my class were shocked to hear that they were starting a business, that there were certain things that they had to file with the IRS. And even though they don't pay taxes, there were certain things they had to do. Learning that they didn't own the nonprofit was shocking to them. I had one student in my class say, well, if I don't own it, what should I be? Should I be the executive director or should I be the board chair? And he, really struggling because his whole thing was control. He wanted to maintain control. And so I think coming to the table, most founders don't realize that there's that level of structure. And most entrepreneurial people are not fond of structure. And so that's what really starts to stymie a founder as well as an organization takes off. Now, all of a sudden, they have to start building structure. That's not what they want to do.
I want to add to that. I used to do a course as well, starting a nonprofit, what you need to know. It was like a half-day workshop. And the first half of the half day, I spent trying to dissuade them from starting a nonprofit. That was always surprising when they got in the room. And the reason was for much of what Stephanie said, but actually maybe even more significant is that there is probably a nonprofit currently existing that is doing something very similar to what you want to do, or maybe identical, but at least similar. And I would usually get through to a certain part of the group in the room to realize, let's first look at who's out there doing this work that I could work with. And that is a better way of going. Now perhaps it's an incubation period, and then eventually it is spun off into its own nonprofit, if that makes sense. Or perhaps the organization you go with, fine, it's just a great home and you stay there. If your focus is on wanting to do the work, to pursue the cause, to right the wrong, as Stephanie said, what's the smartest way of doing that? And that's everything from what kind of business model, because sometimes I would also end up telling people, you're going to be more successful doing that as a for-profit than a nonprofit. Or is it working inside an existing nonprofit, whether forever or as an incubation? Or is it truly the only way you can do it to form your own nonprofit? And I was always clear to say, none of those is a right or wrong answer, but do the research before you decide the answer. When we started the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, there wasn't any other entity that made sense for us to live in. We were the one of the few states that didn't have an association. And so the model existed in other places. So we had a business model to work from. But there was no other place, no other kind of organization in Arizona made sense to be a part of. So we decided to start one. So I never wanted to tell people, don't start one, it's wrong, because I did it more than once. But do the research first.
You've got to have quite a skill set, and you've got to have this entrepreneurial mindset, and you have to have this really deep passion for solving a problem or getting at the crux of whatever you see the issue as. Do you have to be good at fundraising to be a founder?
So I think, one of the questions I would ask in my to be or not to be class was, who cares about this issue as much as you do? And if you're the only one in the room who is passionate about whatever cause you want to start, you're going to have a really hard time getting this thing off the ground, because you can't survive without fundraising. Now, on the flip side, a lot of founders come to the table thinking, well, I'll just put a board of directors together and they'll raise the money because that's their job. And so that's a naivete that a lot of founders bring to the table too, thinking that, oh, well, somebody else will raise the money. So I think it's hard to answer that question, Russ, because at some point, obviously, yes, somebody needs to fund what you're doing. And if you're not good at fundraising, you won't be successful. You won't be able to get your organization off the ground unless you find that level of expertise and bring it along with you on the board. But again, a lot of founders that I've worked with, their first boards are mostly their friends and family who don't have this expertise either. So I think for anybody thinking of starting a nonprofit as a founder, they really have to take a deep look at the funding model and how will they survive. A lot of founders also come to the table thinking, this is going to be a great job for me. I'm going to put this together and this will be my career. And so they have a lot of control over what they want to do and they don't want to let that go. But they're not sometimes willing to allow other people to help them. So I think they have to come in with their eyes open, recognizing there is a funding model that they have to look at. And if they don't have that expertise, how are they going to bring that along?
Just like a business plan, right? You're going to have to find your funding unless you're self-funded. And I imagine that is the case maybe with a handful of nonprofits. They're self-funded. The founder comes in and either has access to money or angel investors or whatever you might call it, and they're able to launch that way.
That's an excellent point, Russ. In fact, it's not necessarily the most common, but it's common enough. It's out there. Is either the person who themselves has the money to fund it, or at least to start it out, or they're connected to that. In some ways, those can be the most difficult situations because they have the money. They obviously get to have the control. But if they don't have a plan for how to expand the financial support beyond their own, to have that business model, and yes, a nonprofit needs a business model just like a for-profit does. It's just that the funding model is different. It actually could have a very earned income-based model tied to it like a for-profit would, but it may not. So depending upon that business model, you have to understand then what's your strategy for securing those other resources that's going to go beyond whoever the initial seed funders are. The other thing, though, to your point about the founder and fundraising, regardless of any of that, it is very often the case in those early days where the founder really is the best fundraiser because of that passion. It's personal. They tell the story just in a completely different way than a professional fundraiser or a board member might do. So they will need to be part of fundraising, but realize it's not about being a quote unquote professional fundraiser. It's being, that you are the person that's going to sell this mission best of all because you started it. You had the passion for it. And that can't carry you forever alone. You need to, as the organization grows, but it is actually really important in the early days.
So can we talk a little bit about the journey that one might expect to take as the founder of a nonprofit?
If you think of it from the life cycles model, so being, a founder starts in the idea stage, and if they're lucky enough, they get it into startup where they're actually getting some traction in the community. But really, that upward curve of the life cycles model is really about building demand for your services. And I think a founder early on, you can tell if you're not building demand for your services, if no one wants your service and funders aren't willing to fund it, that's definitely some writing on the wall that you have to look at. But a lot of founders and a lot of organizations do start getting some traction early on because there are people that need those services or are passionate about it as well. So I think the challenging arc for a founder is, the startup area is the most fun for the founder because founders come with this level of entrepreneurial spirit, and we're just throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks. I think where founders start to struggle is when you are getting traction in the community, and now you're starting to grow as an organization and having to start thinking about the structure of the organization, that as we move from startup into growth is where we now need to start putting some structure around what we do. We need to start having policies and procedures and proper ways of doing things. And we might start hiring our first staff people. So now that is a whole other can of worms with staff people. And now you have to, I remember at Free Arts going into that phase where our first, admin assistant who sat at the front desk showed up in flip-flops and a belly shirt. And I was like, I've got to write a dress policy now. It's like, whoever thought we need to have a dress code policy? So those kinds of things are now what founders are struggling with. And I think that's when you think of the founder's arc, they live in that gray area of startup, and most of them really like it. Now, there are the outlier founders that I think can move through startup into growth. And I know one I'm going to call by name because I think he's fantastic, is Aaron Blocker Rubin from Arizona Autism United. Founded that organization and has been really the most effective person, I think, to take it forward to where they're going. But he also came with a different type of business mentality too. So I think until a founder can recognize maybe my skill set is not taking us into the growth phase and maybe even to maturity, and how can I start delegating or looking for others to play these roles? A lot of founders come with a certain level of hubris and ego that they don't want to let things go. And they think it reflects personally on them if they can't do a certain role in the organization. So that's where things start to get a little sticky.
Is there an opportunity for nonprofit founders to look at the life cycle, to look at the different business models and say, you know what, I don't want to do this in perpetuity. I want to set this up to be a 5-year effort or a 7-year effort. Is that something that you're seeing, or is it becoming more popular to do that?
I would love to talk about that, Russ. So as I mentioned in my introduction, went through different founding experiences. And so the one I did before the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits was an organization called Empower Arizona. And I kind of got it to a certain point, and then I got recruited to start up the Alliance. So I didn't really quite finish. And it unfortunately it survived for about 3 years, but it folded after I left. And I looked back on that and realized there were a number of lessons. One of them was in regard to my role, something that every founder experienced. To be honest with you, this is every nonprofit CEO or executive director experiences. Inevitably, you are seen as the organization. Your name and the organization's name can become synonymous. In fact, it was really scary when I was at the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits. I would walk in the room and sometimes somebody would say, hey, the nonprofits of Arizona all walked in the room just now. And I'm like, holy cow, there's 14,000 nonprofits. I'm not all of them. What are you saying? But it's something that goes along with the leadership of any company, of any organization, as people really identify. But with the founder, it's especially the case because they are the founder. And one of the hardest things to do as a founder is recognize that if you allow that to control the whole story of the organization, it will one day suffer. Regardless of how it happens, you will leave one day. And if you want the cause to continue, if you want your mission to continue, it needs to, you need to be thinking about how it outlives you. I always use the word institutionalize. I know it's kind of an awful sounding word in a way, but that's really what you're trying to do, is create an institution that will survive you. So when I was at the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, I was very conscious of that. I thought a lot about it. I was still seen as the Alliance, and I got that. But when I left, I knew that I had institutionalized enough. And it's been 7 years now, and they've been thriving since I left. And that's what I wanted. And I think if you keep that perspective in mind as a founder, you can be very successful in sort of not holding the organization back around you.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details, and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
Here's the big question. How does a founder know when it's time to step aside?
So I think that's the tough question, because I think a lot of founders don't want to step aside. And I think, to piggyback on what Patrick was saying, most founders, their personal identities are wrapped up in the nonprofit. And I think Patrick is an anomaly, with, his mindset going in. But I think, Patrick, you came with business and nonprofit experience, and you had a very different way of looking at founding your organizations. A lot of the founders that I've worked with, it's so deeply personal. It is who they are. And so even when they do make a separation, whether it's from their perspective or somebody has encouraged them to separate from the nonprofit, it's a loss. It is a personal loss for them to feel like, I'm now being asked to leave this organization that I founded and love, and my whole life has been wrapped up in this. I know, even as the secondary founder of Free Arts, when I left after 14 years, and I was ready to leave, and I looked at it as, what is the legacy I want to leave with this organization, and how do I set that up so that the organization will thrive beyond me? But, similar to Patrick, I would walk into a room and people would say, oh yeah, Free Arts. They wouldn't know my name, but they would know the organization. So, for me, it was thinking about, well, who am I? If I'm not Free Arts, who am I? And what does that mean for my life? And, I'm not even the primary founder of Free Arts. And so for the founder who has come in with this deeply personal issue to separate, it is a loss in their life. And there needs to be a way to, how do we transition founders out when it's time for them to leave, or when they've identified it's time to leave, and support them to allow them to feel that they have, done something successful and that they are leaving a legacy.
I would like to add to that. I left voluntarily when I left the Alliance, and yet I still went through a period of feeling like I had lost identity. It was hard for me to figure out who I was, because I had, for 10 years, I'd been associated with that organization. It's who I was. So you will deal with that no matter how it all happens. But there are a couple of things. One of the things that I did very intentionally was I left when things were very good. I knew that the chances of the transition out were much greater, phenomenally greater, if somebody came in where there were no real problems. There would be a little rockiness with the transition, because that's going to happen when a founder leaves. You can't avoid it. But the organization was stable enough that it will survive that. And I was very thoughtful about, is that the case? So one, you definitely want to leave when things are good. The other thing that is really important, and we could do an entire episode on this topic alone, but it is the board of directors. Stephanie described the early days as often a board is your friends, maybe family, but in order for the organization to grow effectively, as you go through those life cycles, you need to develop a different kind of board. It is a board that is really there on behalf of the community that is benefiting from what the nonprofit's doing. And that board needs to be, if you will, relatively independent of the founder so that you and the board can talk about it together. When is the right time to go? Because it is a point in the life cycle of the organization. We're bringing in a fresh leader with a new kind of skill set for this phase or whatever the dynamic is. We want to do it at the right time. And you, the board, get to hire that person. And so you need to be in this with me. So I would say those are two keys: is get your board to the point where you've got a really solid board that's going to help you through that transition out, and then be thinking about how you can do it when the organization is very strong, and also give notice, advance notice. It's actually a good idea for a founder in particular to have a time period where everybody knows that they're going to be leaving, and help them do that separation again of that identity of the person with the organization.
So as a founder, you might not have the luxury of giving a 2-week notice, in other words. What kind of timeline would you look at if you were, I know it probably depends on where you are in the life cycle of the organization, but roughly could you estimate, is it a year? Is it a couple of years?
I think it probably can depend upon the organization. By the way, we should mention that this particular topic can be just as relevant, even if it's not a founder, but somebody that's been a CEO for 7 to 10 years, who pretty much has that same identification with the organization. I actually recommend a minimum of 6 months, probably ideally a year, that literally it is publicly known that, this is going to happen. It's also, I actually know of a situation where a founder notified their board, and the board agreed to it, but they really didn't want to have to go through it. And so they didn't do anything. So they didn't make it public. So the board kind of dragged their feet. And then finally, at about the 3 months to go mark, they decided maybe we should start figuring out a search. And that transition didn't go as well as it should have. But when you make it public and everybody knows, it kind of holds the board accountable to do the work of finding the new person. So 6 months to a year, I think, is probably a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. And that's the point where, they should hire a consultant, right? To put a plug for all of us, right? To help them through this. So I did work with an organization that had a longtime director who was kind of founder-like. And she gave about almost a year's notice. And that was a gift to the organization, because not only were they able to put together a really solid communications plan for the community, letting staff and donors and those key constituents know, it allowed them to figure out how they were going to honor her for her service as well. And then also, you milk that for what it's worth for fundraising. You have a founder's, an executive director, retirement fund, that kind of thing. So I agree, 6 months to a year. But I would say a lot of founders don't take a proactive approach to their leaving. And unfortunately, what happens to a lot of founders is that their board invites them to retire, or it's more contentious than that, unfortunately. And that's a terrible way for a founder to leave an organization, because as we've been talking, most founders, it is deeply personal. So it feels like you've been fired from something that you've loved and have worked with your whole life. I would say the succession planning piece is something that needs to be talked about early on, even when there's no thought of the founder leaving, but from a historical knowledge perspective, what would happen if this founder had to be away for 3 months with COVID even? Who's going to run the organization? Who's going to look at that? So from the board's perspective, I think one thing that the founder could do more efficiently is building the board that the organization needs, not building the board that the founder needs. So when the founder first starts with their friends and family, that's, helps them, feel like, oh, everybody's rah-rah behind me, I'm doing the right thing. When you start building the board that the organization needs, then you start building some level of expertise on the board that you don't have. And then that also, I think, helps the founder start to realize, oh, we might need a strategic plan. I don't know how to do that. I'm going to need to find somebody either on the board or staff. And so having a board that's supportive of the founder, offering sound business advice and insisting on performing its role in governance in terms of, we need to have strategic planning every year. We need to be looking at where the organization is going and making sure we have that right expertise on the staff. And hopefully, if that's a constructive partnership between the board and the founder, they're working together in ways to identify, well, what skill sets are needed. And hopefully the founder can start to look introspectively, do I have that level of expertise? What is my role with this organization Should I be a leader with the front facing and hire a president CEO that's like the business side of the organization? So I think all of that is in the board's purview to start really making sure that those things are in place.
What are some of the pitfalls or mistakes that nonprofits can make during a transition period?
How long is this podcast?
Yeah, really.
I think, what I see a lot of is what I just kind of talked about is a contentious issue starts to happen between the board and the founder. The board starts to get very unhappy that the founder is not doing the work that they feel that the founder should be doing. The founder gets frustrated with the board because now they're all up in their grill all the time and on top of them. And then rather than having a constructive partnership where they can work together to really have the emotional intelligence, I think that's where a lot of the stems is the emotional intelligence to look at what needs to happen moving forward. They start to get at odds with each other. And then that's when I get a lot of calls from board chairs. We're having this struggle with our CEO. We need this to happen. And so now they're starting to hire outside counsel, but then the founder or the CEO feels like they're left unto themselves with no support. That's a really challenging place to be. So I think that relationship between CEO and board has got to be a positive one to start working through this, because when it becomes contentious, that's just not good for anyone.
I want to build upon that point. And this may be the most vexing part of this process. So I don't know that I have any perfect answers, but the thing is, there is only one person in a nonprofit organization that knows everything inside and outside the organization like nobody else. And that is the CEO. That's whether they're a founder or not, but especially the founder, right? They were there from the beginning. They know all the gritty details. They know the big picture. They know the small picture. When you're on a board, and this becomes even more so as you get that board that should be that community board that isn't, the friends and family, so they're not as tight. How the board isn't going to know all of that. And yet, if a board doesn't understand enough about that, they may not hire the right successor to the founder. And if there's one thing that I would say is a piece of advice to the founder is think about how you prepare your board to know everything they need to know to hire the right person so that there will be a successful successor to the founder. Unfortunately, there is some research that shows that this failure rate of the immediate successor to founders is very high. And I think that's one of the reasons, because boards just don't really understand the job well enough. And that's either they just didn't pay attention, the founder didn't educate them, or probably a lot of different scenarios. So what that means is you need to be interacting with your founder so you understand that. Boards very often don't want their founders involved in the selection process of the successor. I've seen that more often than not. And search consultants will often advise that. And I say, well, I understand not being directly involved. I shouldn't be picking my successor, but make sure you have tapped the mind of the founder enough to know what the job really is. Otherwise, there's a good chance you're going to go through that search process again within a short period of time.
There's a formalized process for succession planning, and a really great resource that I use on a regular basis is a publication called Building Leaderful Organizations. It's through the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And it is a fantastic way of succession planning and looking at 3 different ways of succession planning: building your bench and professional development of the current staff, emergency succession, and then departure-defined succession. And in that publication, they have a checklist of things that boards need to think about to make sure they're prepared for a leader, whether it's a founder or a longtime leader or even a short-term leader. How do we prepare for them leaving? And the first thing is, do we have a strategic plan that outlines the kind of organization we need to be, which will then help us identify the kind of CEO we need to have next? Looking at the role of the outgoing CEO, making sure that there's current job descriptions and all those things put in place, policies and procedures. And then I think we want to talk about a role of an interim director. And I'm a big fan of that because, as Patrick alluded to, oftentimes there's failure. If there's a long-time either founder or even a long-time director, typically the person that comes in after them does not succeed. And I know I experienced that at Free Arts, where 2 people didn't succeed until the third person that they hired. I've seen that with some of my clients, and I think an interim director can help really just identify what are some of the key issues happening in the organization, do an organizational assessment so that the board knows here's some things we need to address before we can bring on the next person. And that interim can also be a counsel to the board in helping the board go through a hiring process, and helping them get all their ducks in a row and be the point person for that. So I'm a huge fan of interims.
I'm so glad you brought up interim leadership. So what are some of these other responsibilities that we should expect of an interim leader, and how long of a position is that? How long does an interim leader stick around?
Yes, I'm really glad we're talking about this interim role. By the way, the research that I've seen was quite some time ago, and I can't remember the actual source, but at the time it was done, it demonstrated about an 80% failure rate. And I think they defined failure rate by, the successor to the founder only lasted for less than 2 years or something like that. They had a way of defining what failure was. But there's also some research that went along with that showed that if you very intentionally bring in an interim after a founder or a very long time CEO, your success rate and then the eventual successor after the interim is much higher. First of all, it's important to define what we mean by interim. We do not mean a board member stepping in and running the organization for a while, and we do not mean a staff member stepping in and running the organization for a while. The ideal model when we're talking about an interim is somebody who is a professional who has, ideally some experience being an interim, at a minimum experience being a CEO of a nonprofit, who has a job to do for a period of time that is defined. They have no interest in having the permanent position, so they are not a candidate for the job. So sometimes boards find a great interim and they say, "Oh, we love you, will you stay?" Well, if you're a professional interim, you will not do that because your job is to do this interim work. So what it is, it's a consulting engagement. Even though you may come in and you're on the staff, you're paid as an employee, you're really there as a consultant. You have a scope of work that defines what needs to happen during the transition. The scope of work will largely define what the length of the engagement is. In some cases, there's not a lot of work to do. So perhaps an interim engagement is 3 months or maybe 4 to 6 months. In other cases, you may find there is so much restructuring of the organization to be set up for somebody who isn't the founder. You may need to be there for a year, maybe a year and a half. I actually did an interim assignment for 2.5 years in one organization. So it really depends upon what that scope of work is. And the board and the interim should define that, very specifically, and then build their search process into that. So they know when is the right time during that period of the scope of work that they can begin searching for the permanent CEO.
So what other roles can a nonprofit founder play at an organization once they've transitioned out of their leadership role?
Well, I know when I left Free Arts, people kept saying, "Oh, are you going to join the board?" And my answer was no. I said I needed to separate not only for myself, but I didn't want to overshadow the incoming leader. And so I felt that my role as the outgoing director was to support the new leader in any way that leader wanted me to support them. I offered lunch, meetings, whatever, but I really felt the need to disconnect and allow that person to find their own way and be supportive in any way they wanted. So Patrick, how did you feel?
Well, at the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, they have a policy council that is basically people from the nonprofit sector advising the Alliance on what kinds of public policy issues to address. And when I was leaving, they said, if you would like, we think it would be good to still have your voice on that policy council. So that wasn't the board of directors. I didn't get to, oversee the entire organization in that role, but I was still connected to really some of the heartbeat of the mission around the advocacy. And it ended up being just the right connection between me and my successor and she called on me a number of times. So if there's a way you can have that kind of connection, it can help you, I think, ease through that process of withdrawal.
I think on that, this is another area that needs to be formally spelled out during the transition process. Just as you're going to formally spell out what is the role of the outgoing director in the succession process, what will be the role of the director after they've left the organization, and really have that spelled out in writing between the two parties so that there's not confusion. Because I had a client where a longtime kind of founding leader was leaving, And he was calling and trying to still call the shots even with the interim director. And the board finally had to say, no more calls, we're cutting you off. They had to, take away some privileges, and it was painful. It's terribly painful. So to have that spelled out as part of the succession process, I think is really important.
And if I could add one more example, these many unnamed examples of things that didn't go well, right? I know of an organization that I'm pretty sure it was a founder. It was somebody that was there for 30 years. So call it a founder, right? And the staff was ready for her to leave. Okay. And then they brought somebody in, and that person didn't work out terribly well. And the board decided to bring the founder back. And basically the staff just about revolted. And so it led to actually a period of tumult in what was a very successful organization. And so these are all things that I think Stephanie is right on about. The board needs to spell this out with great clarity as part of the transition.
Well, Stephanie and Patrick, this has been a fantastic discussion, and you've given us a lot to think about. What do you think are the most important takeaways from this episode for folks? Patrick, maybe you could start.
I'm going to begin with kind of where the two of you started out in fun at the beginning of this notion of the superhero. We need to celebrate and honor. And I mean, honestly, I have such admiration for these nonprofit founders because I know how hard it is to get a nonprofit started. And so anybody who does it and is successful with it and builds something that the community is supporting, they really are heroes. So we do need to celebrate them, applaud them for what they've done. But likewise, we need to help them realize that if truly their passion is about the mission and not about their thing, then they want it to outlast them. They want it to go on without them. And so everybody, the staff, the board, the community, needs to help them put the things in place that when it's time to go, the organization will succeed. After I left the Alliance, I'm almost more proud now than when I was there because I did leave. It was a good transition. The organization's thriving. The Alliance needed to be there forever. That's why we created it to begin with. And it's still there. And I'm almost more proud now than, when I left 10 years ago.
Stephanie, what do you think?
So I think the most important thing for me is to just remember how deeply personal this is for the founder, that this is not just a job. This is not something they applied for. This is deeply personal, and it's a part of their identity and who they are. And I think if boards recognize that and communities recognize that, they perhaps can be a little more gentle in their approach with the transition from a founder and recognizing that this founder needs support. And I think that's the second thing I would take away is that, we revere these for-profit founders, right? Because they're entrepreneurs, we revere them. So why don't we revere our nonprofit founders? You hear the term founders syndrome, which I know Patrick and I both hate that phrase, but people use it all the time in the nonprofit sector. And so why can't we look at our nonprofit founders as social entrepreneurs, who really are making the world a better place? So how can we start building support around that and helping them understand the life cycle model so that they can see that there's a growth phase in their organizational life cycle, and there's also a growth phase in their own personal founder life cycle? How can we start helping them find the board members that live in that startup growth area rather than board members that come in expecting a mature organization and then vilifying the founder for not having a mature organization right off the bat? So what are some of those things? What's the professional development we can offer those nonprofit entrepreneurial founders so that they can learn that, okay, if I want to stay on as a manager, I might be the best leader for this organization, but maybe I'm not the best manager. And if I want to be the best manager, then here's the skills I'll need to develop to do that. So I think that finding ways to support these founders would make our communities so much stronger because most of them are starting organizations that need to be here. So rather than calling them founders syndrome, let's start, referring to them as social entrepreneurs and then helping them identify what is the legacy you want to leave in the world and how can we help you do it.
We are honored that we have had this conversation with two social entrepreneurs on the NPFX podcast. Stephanie, Patrick, where can our listeners go and find out more about you? Stephanie.
So you can go to my website, synergypartnersconsulting.com.
Patrick.
I have my consulting website, leadforchangenow.org, and also Arizona Citizens for the Arts, azcitizensforthearts.org.
Stephanie and Patrick, thank you for all that you are doing for the nonprofit sector in Arizona and around the country. Russ, another great conversation, and I promised you a great origin story, and we made it through almost the whole podcast without saying the words founders syndrome, but we need to make it a practice to eliminate that from our vernacular.
That's right. We're talking about social entrepreneurs, Rich.
Yes, we are.
Social entrepreneurs.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. We'll see you next time.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.